They laughed at her before she even set down her bag. 31 men, 1 woman, and a silence that cut deeper than any blade on the frontier. She had traveled 4 days across broken roads, spent her last coins on a one-way ticket, and stood in the dirt of a dying ranch with nothing but calloused hands and a recipe box that had outlasted everyone she ever loved. They saw her size. They saw what they wanted to see. Not one of them saw what was coming. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The wind off the Wyoming mountains didn't care about dignity. It came down hard and indifferent in the autumn of 1887, raking across the high plains like a hand sweeping crumbs off a table, scattering dust, rattling fence posts, pulling at the brims of worn hats and the hems of tired coats. It was the kind of wind that reminded a person, without apology, that the land out here didn't belong to anyone. It simply tolerated your presence for a while, and then it didn't. Mabel Thornton stepped off the supply wagon at the edge of the Callahan Ranch just past midday, and the wind hit her full in the face like a warning. She didn't flinch. She had grown up in weather worse than this. In a farmhouse with gaps in the walls that whistled all winter, with a father who cooked everything from near nothing and made it taste like abundance, with a mother who left before Mabel was old enough to remember her face. She had grown up understanding that comfort was something you built yourself, with your hands, in a kitchen, 1 meal at a time. The wind could say whatever it wanted. She had heard worse. The wagon driver, a narrow old man named Corcoran who smelled of pipe tobacco and didn't ask questions, handed down her 2 bags without ceremony and clicked his horse forward before she could say thank you. The wagon disappeared around the hill, and Mabel was alone at the entrance of a ranch she had never seen, in a county she had only read about on a posted advertisement tacked to the wall of a general store 300 miles east. Cook wanted. Callahan Ranch, Sheridan County. Hard work, fair wage. Must handle volume, inquire in person. She had read it twice. Then she had taken it off the wall, folded it into her coat pocket, and walked home to pack. That had been 11 days ago. The Callahan Ranch sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, backed against the feet of mountains that were already wearing their first snow-like old men, pulling on gray coats before winter fully arrived. The main house was large but plain, unpainted timber, a wide porch that needed work on the left side, windows that caught the light at an angle that made them look almost warm. Around it spread a collection of outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a feed barn, a smokehouse that had clearly seen better years, a cookhouse set slightly apart from the rest with a rusted stovepipe jutting from the roof. There were cattle in the far distance, not many, fewer than the land could hold, and there were men. A group of them had gathered near the fence line closest to the entrance, the way men gather when they have nothing urgent to do and something interesting has arrived. 7 of them, maybe 8, in various states of Saturday idleness, some sitting on rails, some standing with arms crossed, one whittling something that didn't seem to be turning into anything in particular. They watched her walk up the road. She felt every one of their eyes. Mabel Thornton was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and built the way some women are built when they have spent their whole lives doing physical labor, broadly, solidly, with a fullness to her frame that the fashionable world of 1887 would have called unflattering and that she had long since stopped thinking about, mostly on most days. She had brown hair the color of creek mud in summer, worn pinned back with practical efficiency. Her face was plain in the way honest faces are plain. No particular beauty to advertise, but nothing dishonest either. Her eyes were dark and steady, and the kind that, if a person looked long enough, gave the impression of someone who had already thought through the worst possibilities and made their peace. She wore her good dress, dark wool, fitted at the waist, clean. She had pressed it the night before at the boarding house in Sheridan, hanging it carefully over the back of a chair while she slept on the floor to avoid wrinkling it. She had wanted to arrive looking like a professional. The men by the fence did not appear to notice the dress. What they noticed was everything else. Lord Almighty. The voice came from a thick-necked man with a red beard who was sitting on the top rail of the fence like a rooster on a henhouse. He said it slowly, letting the words carry, making sure everyone heard. A few of the other men glanced at him, then back at her, and the smiles started. Mabel kept walking. "You the one answering the cook advertisement?" The red-bearded man called it out loud enough that it wasn't a question so much as an announcement, making sure everyone within earshot understood what was happening here. "I am," she said. She didn't stop walking. She didn't look at him. "Ranch cook's a hard job, ma'am." There was laughter in his voice, the practiced kind, shaped for an audience. "Lot of heavy lifting, moving barrels, hauling water. You sure you're up to it?" More laughter now, low and rolling, coming from 2 or 3 of the others. The whittling man stopped whittling. Mabel stopped walking. She turned and looked at the red-bearded man with the kind of steadiness that made people momentarily uncertain whether they had misjudged the situation. "I've been hauling water since I was 8 years old," she said, "and every man I've ever cooked for has asked for seconds. You want to keep going, or can I find the person who placed the advertisement?" There was a half-second of silence, the kind that teeters before it falls one way or the other. It fell the wrong way. The laughter came back louder. One man slapped the fence post. The red-bearded man grinned wide enough to show a missing tooth on the left side. "She's got mouth on her, boys," he said approvingly, to the crowd rather than to her, the way men do when they've decided a woman is entertaining rather than serious. "Kitchen's that way, sweetheart. If you can fit through the door." Mabel turned and kept walking. Her jaw was tight. Her hands, down at her sides, were clenched once, hard, and then released. She had done this before, in other towns, other kitchens, other doorways. She had learned a long time ago that responding was gasoline, and silence was the only thing that didn't feed the fire. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and she walked to the main house like she had every right to be there, because she did. Behind her, the laughter continued for another few seconds. Then gradually, the way it always did, it stopped. Men went back to their various forms of nothing. The wind kept moving. Nobody followed her. The man who answered the door of the main house was not what she expected. She had built up a picture in her mind during the long wagon ride. The kind of rancher who posted an advertisement like that, direct and blunt, no frills. She had imagined someone older, heavier, comfortable with authority in the way that money makes men comfortable. Rhett Callahan was none of those things. He was 36, though he wore it like 40. Tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, angular build that comes not from vanity, but from years of hard physical work leaving no excess anywhere. His hair was dark and slightly too long, as if haircuts were a luxury that kept getting postponed. His face was all angles and weathering, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains behind the ranch, eyes that were a pale, clear gray, the color of sky before snow. There was a scar along his left jawline, old and faded, that could have come from any number of things the frontier provides. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the look of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something that mattered more than whatever was at the door. He looked at her, just looked, taking in the same information the men at the fence had taken in, but his face did not move through the same sequence theirs had. It did not move at all, particularly. "You're answering the advertisement," he said. It was not a question. "Mabel Thornton," she said. "I cook for large groups. I've run the kitchen at the Harlan boarding house in Casper for 3 years, the mining camp at Rock Springs the 2 years before that. I can do breakfast, dinner, and supper for up to 40 men, 365 days, and I haven't lost a single man to food poisoning, which is more than most camp cooks can say." Something moved briefly in those gray eyes, not quite a smile, something more like attention. The way a person looks when they've been half listening and suddenly find themselves fully listening without quite deciding to. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of the main house was sparse in the way of a man who has learned to live without accumulation. Not poverty, exactly, but a deliberate stripping away of everything non-essential. A large table. Chairs that had been repaired rather than replaced. A stone fireplace with a mantel that held only a lamp and a small photograph she couldn't see clearly from where she stood. Maps tacked to one wall, covered in pencil marks and calculations. A ledger open on the table to a page that, from her brief glance, looked deeply unhappy. He did not offer her tea. He sat at the table and she sat across from it, and he asked her questions in the direct, unhurried way of a man who has learned that time is a material resource, and wasting it has a cost. How many men had she cooked for at maximum capacity? What she knew about stretching provisions in drought conditions. Whether she could handle game meat as well as beef, Whether she had medical experience, not nursing specifically, but the practical kind, the kind that comes from being the person on a remote property who has to handle things before a doctor can be reached. She answered everything plainly. No elaboration, no performance, just answers. He listened. He wrote nothing down. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she began calculating the cost of the next wagon back to Sheridan. "You saw the men at the fence," he said. "Yes." "And you're still sitting here." "I'm still sitting here." He studied her for a moment. That same flat, gray-eyed look. Then he said, "I have 31 men on this property. Most of them have opinions about things that aren't their business. The last 3 cooks we hired left inside a month. 2 of them were men." He paused. "The work is harder than the advertisement says. The hours are longer. The conditions this winter are going to be difficult because we're in the second year of a drought, and the supply situation is not what I'd like it to be." "I know what a drought does to supply," she said. "Do you?" "My father ran a farm through the dry years of 71 and 72. We fed a family of 6 plus 3 hired hands on land that was producing 40% of its normal yield. You learn to think differently about food when there's not enough of it. You stop thinking about what you want to cook, and you start thinking about what the body needs and how to get there with the least waste." Rhett Callahan looked at her for another long moment. "Wage is $12 a month," he said, "plus room, board, and use of the cookhouse." She had expected 10. She didn't let the surprise show. "That's acceptable." "You start tomorrow." He stood up, which she understood to mean the conversation was over. She stood as well, picked up her bag, and waited. He looked at her once more, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief she almost doubted it had happened, something in his face was not entirely closed. Not warmth, exactly. More like acknowledgement, the recognition of something that had been assessed and found adequate. "The bunkhouse is full," he said. "There's a room at the back of the cookhouse. Small. Drafts in winter. You'll need extra blankets." "I've slept colder," she said. He nodded once and walked back toward his maps. She found the cookhouse on her own. It was roughly 20 by 30 feet, with a cast iron range that was older than she was but well maintained, a prep table long enough to be genuinely useful, a pot rack that had been hung by someone with practical intelligence, and a pantry that told a story she read quickly and grimly, half-empty sacks of flour. Dwindling salt, lard running low, dried beans, plenty of those, some salt pork, some cornmeal, a small collection of preserved vegetables that someone had put up, probably last year, probably under better conditions than now. 2 crates of apples, older but still good. A smoke-blackened cookbook with no cover that had been left behind by a previous occupant and never thrown away, as if whoever left it knew someone would need it eventually. In the corner nearest the back wall, a narrow door led to the room Rhett had mentioned. He had not exaggerated about the draft. She could feel it the moment she opened the door. A thin, persistent current of cold air coming from somewhere in the low left corner of the outer wall. There was a cot, a small table, a hook for clothes, a window so grimy it let in light, but not view. Mabel set her bags down. She sat on the edge of the cot for a moment, which creaked with the seriousness of old wood under pressure. She looked at the room. This was the room where she had arrived. She had left a boarding house position in Casper that was not terrible. Steady work, reasonable women to work alongside, a town that had mostly learned to leave her alone. She had spent what she'd saved on a ticket and a prayer that somewhere out here, past the judgment of people who already knew her face, she might find a place that needed what she actually had to offer. The room was cold. The cot was uncomfortable. The draft was real. She sat with all of that for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she stood up, hung her coat on the hook, rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and walked back into the kitchen to figure out what she had to work with. She was up at 4:30 the next morning. The ranch was silent at that hour except for the horses, who moved and breathed in the dark barn with a patient, ancient sound that she found calming. She lit the range from coals she had kept banked through the night, a skill she had learned early because starting a fire from nothing at 4 in the morning is a miserable business, and there's no reason to do it if you are paying attention. The cast iron heated slowly and evenly, which was good. Bad stoves are the enemy of serious cooking. She worked through what she had. The biscuits were the foundation. She knew this. There is no faster way to communicate competence to a group of hungry men than a biscuit that comes apart correctly. That particular marriage of flaky and tender that requires real butter, real attention, and a hand that knows when to stop working the dough. She had been making biscuits since she was 4 years old. Her hands knew the dough the way some people know music, not by thinking, but by feel. While the first biscuits went in, she put the beef on. The smoking process was slower than the baking. She had found a reasonable cut in the cold storage. Not prime, but workable. And she had started it the evening before, low and indirect, using apple wood from a small stack she'd found behind the cookhouse. By morning, it was nearly there. She finished it in the range oven while the biscuits cooked and started the gravy in the largest skillet she could find, building it from the drippings up, adding flour and cream, and a careful hand with the salt because men doing physical labor need salt, but they don't need to know you've given it to them. The apple preserves had been a question. The apples in the crate were older, slightly soft in places, on the honest edge of too far gone. She had sorted them the night before by candlelight, keeping the good ones, cutting the bad parts off the borderline ones, creating a pile she had cooked down with a small amount of the ranch's precious sugar and a handful of dried cinnamon from a jar in the very back of the pantry, probably forgotten by whoever had been here before her. The resulting preserves were not elegant. They were deeply, honestly good, the kind of thing that tasted like a place and a season, like someone's particular grandmother's kitchen, like memory made edible. At 5:45, she set the table. She had found tablecloths, old, plain, but clean, in a trunk she'd investigated the evening before. She shook them out, laid them flat, set out plates and cups with the efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times. She set out the biscuits in baskets. She set out the gravy in a pot with a ladle. She sliced the beef and arranged it on a platter. She put the apple preserves in 4 bowls spaced evenly down the long table. Then she went to the door of the cookhouse and did not ring the bell. She simply opened the door and let the smell do what it was going to do. The first man to stop was the whittler from the day before. He was walking past with his head down and his collar up, and the particular purposeful shuffle of a man who expects nothing good to come from the day, and he stopped at the edge of the cookhouse door the way a dog stops when it hears a sound it can't immediately explain. His head came up, his nostrils flared. He stood there for a moment, then he walked in. Within 10 minutes, every man on the ranch was at the table. Not talking, not yet. They ate the way men eat when something has caught them genuinely off guard, with concentration, with their eyes going briefly to each element on the plate before they committed to it, with the particular silence that is not hostility, but its opposite. The silence of being fully occupied with something worth occupying yourself with. The red-bearded man, whose name, she had learned, was Dolan, was the last one in. He came through the door with the residual swagger of the day before, took his plate with the air of someone who had decided in advance not to be impressed, and sat at the far end of the table. He ate 1 biscuit, then he ate a second. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at her, but he put the biscuit in his mouth and chewed it, and something in his face rearranged itself incrementally, and he reached for the gravy, and then the beef, and then, with the careful, unhurried gesture of someone who doesn't want to be observed doing something they can't explain, he spooned a second portion of apple preserves onto his plate. Every plate came back empty. Mabel stood at the far end of the kitchen and washed the first pan while they ate, her back to the table, giving them the privacy of being surprised without an audience. She had done this before. She knew what food could do, and she had learned a long time ago not to make people feel watched while it was doing it. Food was its own argument. It didn't need her to stand there and make a case. The men filed out. None of them said anything directly to her. 3 of them, independently, paused at the door with their hats in their hands and the particular posture of men who have thought of something to say and decided they weren't sure how to say it. None of them said it, but none of them laughed either. And by the time she began the preparations for the midday meal, the ranch felt, in some small and unmistakable way, different from how it had felt the morning before. Mabel had not arrived at the Callahan Ranch looking for kindness. She had stopped expecting kindness from strangers sometime around her 18th birthday, when she had understood, fully, finally, with the settling clarity of a decision rather than a wound, that the world was not going to look at her and see what she was. It was going to look at her and see what it expected. The 2 things were not the same. They had not been the same for as long as she could remember, and she had spent years being angry about it before she had arrived at something more useful, the understanding that the only opinion of her that genuinely mattered was the one she formed herself, in the quiet, private territory of her own assessment. She knew what she was worth. She knew it the way she knew the biscuit dough. Not because someone had told her, but because she had paid attention. She was worth quite a lot. The problem with the frontier, the problem with most places, if she was honest, was that worth of that kind was invisible to people who weren't looking for it. You couldn't see competence the way you could see a face or a figure. You couldn't smell it the way you could smell bad meat. It had to be demonstrated, repeatedly, over time, until the weight of evidence became too heavy for even the most stubborn skepticism to hold up. She had been demonstrating for 26 years. She was not tired of it exactly, but she had gotten, over those years, very good at reading rooms, at understanding which silences meant contempt and which meant recalibration, at knowing when she had an audience that was genuinely listening, even if they weren't ready to admit it. Standing in the cookhouse at the Callahan Ranch, washing the breakfast pans in water she'd heated herself, she listened to the ranch settle back into its morning rhythms around her. The distant sound of hooves, the creak of the barn doors, the low conversation of men returning to work. And she understood that something had shifted just slightly in the composition of the air. Not acceptance, not yet. But the laughter was gone, and in her experience, that was always where things began. She spent her first week learning the ranch the way she always learned a new place, systematically, quietly, and without making it obvious that she was doing so. She inventoried the pantry with the careful eye of a person who understands that food supply is a strategic resource, not just a cooking problem. She noted what was running low, what had been ordered but hadn't arrived, what was being wasted through poor storage, and what was being wasted through poor planning. She found 3 sacks of cornmeal in the far corner of the supply barn that nobody had thought to move into the dry pantry, and were now on the edge of ruination from moisture. She moved them herself, in the evening when nobody was watching, restoring what she could. She fixed the smoke seal on the smokehouse door, which had been letting cold air in and slowing the curing process. This had been causing a subtle but consistent problem with the preserved meats. They were taking longer than they should have, and developing an off note in the back of the flavor. She found the gap, plugged it with material from a scraps bin near the carpentry shed, and didn't mention it to anyone. She noticed the supply records. This was the thing that troubled her most in those first days, more than the food situation, more than the men's lingering unease around her presence. The supply records were kept in a ledger in the cookhouse, presumably because whatever cook had preceded her had maintained them, and they were a mess. Not fraudulent, she didn't think, just disordered, maintained irregularly, with gaps and inconsistencies that meant the actual current state of the ranch's supplies was genuinely unclear to anyone trying to read them. Decisions were being made on estimated information. Estimated information, in a drought, with a debt situation already under pressure, was a silent disaster in the making. She began maintaining them herself. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce it. She simply started recording properly. Every delivery, every quantity consumed, every item depleted, every item approaching critical level. She created a simple projections column, the kind of thing her father had taught her when she was 12 years old, and he was trying to figure out whether they could make it to spring on what they had. By the end of the week, she had a clear picture. It was not a comfortable picture, but it was a real one, and real was always better than comfortable, because at least with real, you could make plans. On the 8th evening, she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. She was in the cookhouse, finishing the cleanup from supper, and the voices came through the thin walls with enough force that she could hear the words even when she wasn't trying to. "Second month, we've missed the payment, Callahan. I know what month it is. The bank isn't going to wait forever. Henderson's already told Pierce he'd take the north parcel at 60 cents on the dollar, and Pierce is telling everyone who'll listen that by spring, I said, I know." A third voice, lower, that she couldn't quite make out. Then Rhett's voice again, tighter than the others, the way a rope gets tight when it's close to the end. "What I need is time, and what I need is for people to stop telling me what I already know and start telling me something I can use." A door then. Heavy feet on porch steps. Silence. Mabel stood very still in the cookhouse with a dish towel in her hands, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about her supply ledger. about the projections column, about the smokehouse seal and the cornmeal and the 3 weeks of waste reduction she had already quietly implemented. She thought about a drought she had watched her father survive through a combination of precision, stubbornness, and the willingness to think about problems differently than the people around him had thought about them. She set the dish towel down on the prep table. She opened her supply ledger to a fresh page and picked up her pencil, and she began to calculate. The ranch, Mabel had come to understand in her first 8 days, was not dying from drought alone. Drought was the immediate cause, the visible wound. But underneath the wound was something else, a pattern of assumptions that had been reasonable in better conditions and were slowly, invisibly, becoming fatal in these ones. The assumption that supply would be consistent, so stockpiling wasn't necessary. The assumption that the old ways of running the cookhouse were adequate, so nothing needed changing. The assumption that the only thing that mattered was the cattle, so everything else, the kitchen, the records, the preservation of materials, was secondary. These assumptions were understandable. They were the assumptions of men who had learned this land in prosperous years and were applying prosperous year thinking to drought year conditions. They were wrong. And being wrong, quietly and consistently, was costing the ranch money it could not afford to lose. Mabel did not say any of this to anyone. She simply began, methodically and without fanfare, to be right. She restructured the meal planning to reduce waste while maintaining the caloric density that men doing physical labor genuinely needed. She found that by adjusting the cooking sequence, by using the rendered fat from one meal to start the base of the next, by timing the baking to use the oven heat from the morning fire through to midday rather than letting it go cold and rebuilding it, she could cut fuel consumption by nearly a third. She knew numbers. She had always known numbers. Her father had not been a rich man or an educated one, but he had understood that running a farm was an accounting problem dressed up in dirt and weather, and he had taught his daughter to think in quantities and ratios before she was old enough to understand what she was being taught. She understood it now. By the end of her second week, she had saved the Callahan Ranch more money than her monthly wage, through changes that no one had noticed except through their vague, impossible-to-articulate sense that things were, somehow, running better. She said nothing about it. She kept cooking, she kept calculating, and she waited, with the quiet patience of someone who has learned that the work speaks for itself, for the moment when someone would finally decide to listen. The third week arrived with a cold front that came down from the mountains without warning and turned the ground hard overnight. Mabel felt it before she saw it. In the way the cookhouse walls contracted slightly against the pressure change, in the particular quality of silence that precedes serious cold on the high plains, in the ache across her knuckles as she worked the morning dough. She had learned to read weather the same way she read supply ledgers. Not dramatically, not with any special gift, just with the accumulated attention of a person who understood that the information was always there if you bothered to look for it. She added a second pot of oats to the breakfast lineup that morning. Men working in sudden cold burn through heat faster than they realize. They needed the fuel whether or not they knew they were asking for it. Nobody commented on the oats. They simply ate them. This was the thing she had come to understand about the men of the Callahan Ranch over her first weeks there. They were not, individually, bad men. They were frontiermen, which meant they had been shaped by a particular kind of hardness, a culture that moved in groups and made its judgments fast and loud, because fast and loud was how the frontier moved on most things. The laughter at the fence that first day had not been cruelty for its own sake. It had been the instinct of a group defending its existing order against something unfamiliar, the way a herd of horses will circle and stamp at something new in the pasture before they've decided whether it's a threat. They had been deciding these past weeks. She could feel it. Dolan, the red-bearded instigator from the fence, had taken to arriving at breakfast exactly 2 minutes before the other men, which she had noticed and said nothing about. He came in alone in that narrow window, poured his own coffee, he'd learned where she kept the cups, and stood at the far end of the prep table with the air of someone who was simply cold and needed warmth, which was almost certainly true, and also almost certainly not the entire truth. He never spoke to her directly, but he had taken to refilling the firewood bin beside the range without being asked, appearing to do it coincidentally, in passing, as though the task had simply occurred to him in the vicinity of the cookhouse and had nothing to do with the woman working inside it. She let him have the fiction. A younger hand named Ellis, 19, from somewhere in eastern Nebraska, homesick in a way he worked very hard to hide, had started lingering after the evening meals, ostensibly to return dishes that others had forgotten, and had twice asked her questions about cooking that were so technically specific she had finally looked at him with honest curiosity and asked whether he was planning to cook for himself someday. He had gone very red and said no, absolutely not. He was just asking. She had handed him a recipe card she'd written out from memory and told him the proportions were important to get right, and he had folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket without another word. These were small things. They were the small things that preceded larger ones, and she understood the sequence. She had been through it before, in the mining camp, in the boarding house, in every new place she had arrived carrying nothing but her skill and her stubbornness and the knowledge that patience, applied consistently, changes things. Not quickly, not with fanfare, but with the same reliability as water working on stone. What she had not anticipated was the ranch itself. She had understood from her first week that the Callahan Ranch was in trouble. She had read it in the supply ledgers, heard it in the voices through the cookhouse wall that first evening, seen it in the deliberate blankness of Rhett's face whenever someone brought up timelines or payments, or the words that kept appearing in the overheard conversations between him and the 2 or 3 men who seemed to be his closest advisors, the word debt and the name Pierce. She had gathered from fragments that a man named Warren Pierce owned the neighboring property to the east, that Pierce had been watching the Callahan Ranch the way carrion birds watch a horse that stopped moving, not actively causing the problem, but very much prepared to benefit from it. That the drought had pushed Rhett into a loan arrangement with a bank in Sheridan whose patience was described by everyone who mentioned it with the particular careful language people use when they're describing something that frightens them. She had gathered all of this. What she had not yet fully understood was the scale of it. She came to understand it on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week, when she walked to the main house to report a supply shortfall that required Rhett's decision. She had found that the salt pork stores were lower than the ledger had shown, possibly because the previous recording had been estimating rather than counting, and she needed to know whether to order from Sheridan or attempt to stretch what they had, and found him standing at the table with the open ledger in front of him and the particular stillness of a man who is trying very hard not to show that something has knocked the air out of him. She stopped at the doorway. "Mr. Callahan?" He looked up. The gray eyes were flat, controlled, giving nothing away except the control itself, which in her experience meant there was something considerable being controlled. "I can come back," she said. "What is it?" She told him about the salt pork. She laid it out plainly, the way she always laid things out. Current quantity, projected consumption rate, days until critical shortage, the 2 options as she saw them, the cost difference between them. She kept it short. She knew he was in the middle of something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Order from Sheridan," he said. "Get what we need, not more." "Yes, sir." She turned to go. "Thornton." She stopped. "These numbers you've been keeping." He said it without inflection, but his eyes had moved to the supply ledger she carried, the one she'd been maintaining since her 2nd day. "Come here." She crossed the room and laid the ledger open on the table beside his. He looked at both of them for a moment, the chaos of the old records and the clean columns of hers. He didn't say anything. He turned through several pages of her ledger, slowly, studying the projections column with the focused attention of someone who has seen something they recognize and had not expected to find here. "You did this yourself," he said. "Yes." "You've been doing it since when?" "My 2nd day." Another silence. He turned one more page. "You've also been adjusting the meal structure," he said. "I wasn't told." "No, I didn't think it required approval. I was hired to cook." His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was deciding something. "It doesn't require approval," he said after a moment, "but it affects the men's morale, and I need to know what affects the men's morale." "Their morale seems adequate," she said carefully. Something moved in his face that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, close enough that she noticed it and filed it away. "It's better than it was," he said, "which I didn't expect." He closed the ledger. "The adjustments you've made, do they hold if we have a bad supply month?" "I've run the projections for 3 scenarios," she said. "Normal supply, reduced by 20%, and reduced by 40%. The current adjustments hold through the 20% scenario without any impact on the men's caloric needs. At 40%, we'd need additional changes, which I've identified but not implemented, because we're not there yet. He looked at her. It was a different look than the one she had been getting from him, and different from the one she got from everyone else. It was not assessment of the kind she was used to, the quick cataloging of surface information that preceded dismissal. It was something more focused, the look of a man confronting a specific and unexpected thing and taking the time to actually see it. "Show me," he said, "the 40% scenario." She sat down, opened her ledger to the right page, and showed him. They talked for 45 minutes. It was, in her experience at the ranch, the longest conversation she had ever had with Rhett Callahan, and the most direct and the most useful. He asked questions that were precise and relevant. She answered them. When she made an observation about the waste pattern in the feed barn, she had noticed it in passing and mentioned it almost as an aside. He went very still for a moment and then asked her to repeat it. "The feed barn," she said again. "Third bay from the left. The way it's stacked, the older bales are in the back. Men are taking from the front, which is the newest stock. The older bales at the back are degrading. I noticed the smell when I walked past last week. It's not ruined yet, but if the rotation isn't reversed soon, you'll lose maybe a quarter of what's back there." He stood up. "I'll send someone this afternoon," he said. "I can write down the rotation method my father used if it would help." Another of those pauses. "Yes," he said. "That would help." When she left the main house 20 minutes later, she walked back through the cold morning air with something careful and private moving in her chest. Not pride, exactly, or not only that. Something more complex. The feeling of being, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, genuinely seen. Not the surface of her, not the parts of her that were easy to dismiss or mock or reduce to a single obvious characteristic. The actual substance of what she was, and what she knew, and what she could do. It was a feeling she did not quite trust yet, but she let herself have it for the walk back to the cookhouse, and then she put it away, and she started the preparations for the midday meal. The work was always there. The work, she had learned, was the most reliable thing. The October cold deepened through that week and into the next, and with it came the particular rhythms of a working ranch tightening into winter patterns. Longer hours, harder physical work. Men coming in for meals with the pinched, red-edged look of people who have spent too much time in insufficient temperatures. Mabel adjusted the menus accordingly, leaning harder into the high-calorie, slow-digesting meals that sustained the body through cold weather labor. Thicker stews, more bread, beans that had been long soaked and slow-cooked until they were almost meaty with their own depth, supplemented with salt pork when the stores allowed, and with smoked game when they didn't. The change in the cookhouse had become, by this point, something even the most resistant men could not rationally deny. Meals at the Callahan Ranch were not supposed to be good. Previous cooks, the succession of them, each lasting less time than the last, had produced food that was edible in the basic biological sense, sufficient to prevent men from starving, and not much more. The cookhouse had been a place men came to because they had to, not because they wanted to. Now men arrived early. There was no policy about this. Nobody had announced anything. But Mabel had noticed, somewhere in the third week, that the time between the first man arriving for supper and the last had contracted significantly. Men who had previously drifted in at the latest possible moment, completing one more task, finishing one more thing, delaying the mandatory pause of a meal, were arriving earlier, some of them suspiciously close to the time when the smell from the cookhouse had typically reached the bunkhouse door. She said nothing about this. She simply made sure there was always enough. Ellis had begun helping her clean up after the evening meal. He had not exactly asked permission for this either. He had simply begun doing it in the natural, slightly defiant way of a young man who has decided that something matters and doesn't want to make a whole thing of it. He cleared plates, stacked them, carried water from the pump when the bucket was running low. In return, she let him ask his cooking questions, which were getting steadily more specific and had begun, she thought, to sound less like casual curiosity and more like someone practicing the vocabulary of a thing they had privately decided to pursue. "The biscuits," he said one evening, his long Nebraska arms moving efficiently through the dishwater. "The ones this morning. What did you do different?" She looked at him. "What made you think something was different?" "They were lighter, The inside texture was different, like layered but not flaky exactly, kind of both. She had, in fact, slightly modified the folding technique that morning, experimenting with a method her father had described once but never fully demonstrated, working from memory and instinct. The result had been exactly what Ellis had identified. Lamination, she said, like pastry, but applied to biscuit dough. You fold the butter into layers instead of cutting it in. It's more work. Can you show me? Next batch, she said. If you're here. He was there. She showed him the fold, hands working quickly through the cold dough, and he watched with the fierce attention of someone memorizing rather than merely observing. He tried it himself on the second half of the batch, and the result was uneven but recognizable, the first honest attempt of someone with actual aptitude rather than just interest. Better than your first biscuit, I'd guess, she said. He grinned, wide and sudden, the unguarded smile of a teenager who has forgotten, for a moment, to perform adulthood. My first biscuit could have been used as a doorstop, he admitted. She laughed. It came out before she decided to let it, which was the best kind. That's how everyone's first biscuit is, she said. The only cure is making the second one. That evening, she heard him retelling something from the cookhouse to two other hands outside the bunkhouse window. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard the tone, which was easy and animated. The tone of someone sharing something they found genuinely worth sharing. She did not hear what they said back. She heard laughter, but it was the even, comfortable kind that means someone has said something true that lands well. Not the other kind. She stood in the cookhouse a moment, listening to it, and then she went back to her ledger. The numbers were not improving as fast as she needed them to. She had been working through the projections every night for 3 weeks now, updating them as new information arrived, adjusting the calculations as conditions changed. The efficiency gains she had made in the cookhouse were real. She had documented them carefully, and they were not trivial. But they were also not enough, not at the scale the ranch needed. Not against a debt obligation that was, by her understanding of the fragments she'd overheard and the carefully vague answers Rhett had given when she directly asked, more serious than anything a kitchen reorganization was going to fix. The drought was the core problem. The drought had reduced the cattle output. Reduced cattle output meant reduced income. Reduced income against a fixed debt obligation meant the gap was growing, not shrinking, every month, regardless of how much fat she trimmed from the cookhouse budget. She sat with her pencil above the ledger page and thought about this for a long time. She was a cook. She had been hired to cook. The ranch's financial situation was not technically her problem to solve. She thought about her father, about the way he had looked at the farm during the dry years, not as a single problem, but as a system, a collection of variables, some of which he couldn't control and some of which he could. He had not wrung his hands about the rain. He had made a list of everything that was within his power to change, and then changed it, one item at a time, with the stubborn, joyless efficiency of a man who understood that feeling bad about a situation was a luxury that productive time could not afford. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger. At the top she wrote, "What the ranch has that people will pay for." She stared at the blank page beneath it for a moment. Then she started writing. The list was longer than she'd expected. The cattle were the obvious answer, the core business, the primary income source, the thing the ranch was built around. But the drought had constrained that, and the drought was not within her power to change. What else? The land itself. Large, well-positioned, with access to mountain water sources that the lower-lying properties didn't have. Rhett was not going to sell the land, and she wouldn't have suggested it even if she thought he might. The location. On the main road between Sheridan and the mountain passes, which meant a consistent flow of travelers, traders, supply wagons, seasonal workers moving between positions. The cookhouse. She stopped. She had been thinking about the cookhouse as a resource for the ranch, as the place that fed the workers, maintained morale, reduced waste. She had not been thinking about it as something that could generate revenue on its own. She picked up her pencil and wrote, "Community dinners." She sat with it. The idea, as it took shape in her mind, was not complicated. It did not need to be complicated. Complicated ideas, in her experience, were usually ideas that hadn't been fully thought through yet. Simple ones worked because they were simple. Travelers stopped at ranches along this road. They always had. It was the custom of the frontier born from necessity. You fed travelers. They paid what they could. The transaction was understood by everyone. But the current custom was haphazard, occasional, small. A plate here, a cup of coffee there, whatever the cook could spare from the ranch's own provisions. What if it were regular? What if it were announced in advance? What if it were, in the language her mind kept returning to, an event? Something people came to deliberately, knowing what to expect, willing to travel a distance for it. She thought about the apple preserves. She thought about the way Dolan had put a second spoonful on his plate without wanting anyone to see him do it. She thought about the particular kind of hunger she had been feeding here. The kind that was not only caloric, that was the hunger for something careful, something made with attention, something that tasted like someone had thought about the person eating it. There was a market for that. She knew there was. She had seen it over and over in every kitchen she'd ever worked. She wrote the idea out in full, with numbers, estimated costs, estimated revenue, a conservative projection for the first month, and a slightly less conservative one for the third. She cross-referenced it with the existing supply ledger to confirm it was feasible without disrupting the ranch's own food security. It was feasible. It was more than feasible. If the projections held even at their most conservative estimate, it could generate enough additional monthly income to meaningfully slow the bleeding. She closed the ledger. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cover, in the cold quiet of the cookhouse, with the range ticking down from the evening's heat and the Wyoming wind moving outside the walls with its usual indifference. She would have to take this to Rhett. She did not know, with certainty, how he would receive it. He had listened to her about the supply ledger, about the feed barn rotation, about the salt pork. He had listened with genuine attention, the kind that preceded genuine action, and the things she had told him had turned out to be right, which she suspected he had now established to his own satisfaction. But this was different from those things. Those had been improvements to systems he already had. This was something new. This was her, a hired cook 2 months into her first season at a struggling ranch, walking into the room of a man who had built this property from very little and was watching it threatened and proposing that the answer involved her kitchen and her food and her particular understanding of what people were hungry for. She was aware with clear and unsentimental honesty of how that might land. She was also aware that the projections were sound, that the idea was good, and that the distinction between what she was and what people expected her to be had never, not once, changed the truth of what she actually was. She would take it to him in the morning. She banked the range coals for the night, checked that the doors were properly sealed against the cold, and walked through the dark to her small room at the back of the cookhouse. The draft in the low left corner of the outer wall was still there. She had never gotten around to fixing it, always something more urgent to address first. She had taken to tucking a folded blanket against it before she slept, which was not an elegant solution, but was an effective one. She lay on the cot in the dark, listening to the wind. She thought about her father's kitchen on the driest year of the drought, when they had made a meal out of almost nothing, and her father had set it on the table with the same straightforward dignity he would have given to abundance. And her younger brother had said it tasted good, and her father had said, "Of course it does. I made it carefully," as though that were simply the end of the matter, as though care were always sufficient. She had been 17. She had believed him then. She still believed him now, which she supposed was the truest inheritance she had. Not the recipe box, not the technical knowledge, not even the steady hands, just that belief. That quiet, iron conviction that care, applied consistently and without apology, was always sufficient. The wind moved outside. The ranch settled into night. Mabel Thornton closed her eyes and thought about what she was going to say in the morning, and how she was going to say it, and whether the man on the other side of the table was the kind of man who, when presented with a real thing plainly, could see it for what it was. She thought he might be. She intended to find out. She brought the ledger to him the next morning, before breakfast, because she had learned that Rhett Callahan's mind was sharpest before the day had accumulated its weight on him. She had also learned that he preferred information delivered without preamble, that the kind of conversational softening that most people use to introduce difficult or unexpected ideas read to him as evasion, and that evasion made him close off in a way that took time to undo. So she walked to the main house with the ledger under her arm and knocked twice, and when he opened the door, she said, "I have an idea about the revenue problem. I'd like 15 minutes. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes and then stepped back from the door. She laid the ledger open on the table and walked him through it. She had organized it the same way she organized her supply projections, in plain columns, with the assumptions stated clearly above each calculation so he could challenge the assumptions rather than the math, which she had found was almost always where a reasonable disagreement actually lived. She showed him the cost estimate for a weekly community dinner. She showed him the conservative revenue projection, the moderate projection, and what she had labeled simply if it works, the figure that applied if the dinners became what she believed they could become, which was a destination rather than a stopover, a reason to travel rather than a convenience along the road. She showed him the comparison against the current debt timeline. She waited. Rhett stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that carved stone way it had, looking at the numbers. He had put on a coat but not his hat, which meant he had not yet been outside, which meant she had caught him in the narrow window before the day took him. She counted this as deliberate good fortune rather than luck, because she had been watching his morning patterns for 6 weeks, and the distinction between the two was information well used. "You're talking about turning the cookhouse into a public dining room," he said. "Weekly," she said. "Not every day. Friday evenings, I'd suggest. Travelers stopping for the weekend, local families who've ridden in for Saturday trade in Sheridan. The road traffic is highest on Fridays. I've been watching it." "You've been watching the road traffic." "I've been watching everything," she said without apology. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite the near amusement she'd seen before, but something in that direction. He turned back to the ledger. "You'd need help in the kitchen for a dinner that size." "Ellis," she said immediately. "He has aptitude and he's motivated. I can have him ready within 3 weeks. I'd also need 2 of the other hands for serving and cleanup. I'd rotate them so it doesn't create consistent resentment." "And you think people will come?" She met his eyes. "I think people are already hungry for what I make. I think they don't know it yet because they haven't had the chance to find out. Once they have—" She paused. "Word travels fast in small territories. You know that better than I do." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the early sounds of the ranch beginning its day drifted through the walls. The barn door, the pump, 2 men's voices exchanging something brief and practical. "If it doesn't work," he said, "we've spent money we don't have. I've accounted for that. The first dinner can be funded entirely from the waste reduction savings from the past 6 weeks. It costs us nothing we weren't already losing." He looked at her sharply. "I kept the receipts," she said, and turned to the back of the ledger where she had documented every efficiency gain with the same careful notation she applied to everything else. Rhett Callahan looked at those receipts for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face had the expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that came when something had overcome his considerable resistance to being surprised by her. 3 weeks, he said. "Get it ready." She picked up the ledger. "Yes, sir." She was halfway to the door when he said, without particular emphasis, "Thornton." She turned. "How long have you been running numbers on this ranch's finances?" "Since the first week," she said. "I needed to understand the supply situation fully. You can't understand supply without understanding money." The pause that followed was the kind that fills with something unspoken. Not tension, exactly, but the pressure of a recognition looking for a place to land. "All right," he said, and turned back to the maps on his wall. She walked back to the cookhouse in the bright cold morning and felt, with the precise and methodical pleasure of a craftsperson whose measurements have proven sound, that the thing she had been building toward for 3 weeks had now officially begun. The preparation occupied every available hour of the following 3 weeks in a way that Mabel found genuinely satisfying, which she thought said something true about her character. She had never been someone who thrived in stillness. She thrived in the organized momentum of a complex task moving toward completion, the feeling of many things developing simultaneously, each at its own pace, each requiring a different kind of attention, all of them converging toward a single moment of execution. This was what she had loved about serious cooking from the beginning. It was architecture made edible. It required you to think across time, to know that the thing you were starting now would be ready in 3 hours, that the thing you were finishing now had started yesterday, that the sequencing was as important as the skill. She trained Ellis in earnest during those 3 weeks, and he proved to be even more capable than she'd estimated. He had good hands, quick and sure, the kind that learn physical skills by doing rather than by being told. And more importantly, he had genuine curiosity, which was the thing that separated adequate cooking from real cooking. Anyone could follow a sequence if they were paying attention. The people who became real cooks were the ones who wanted to understand why the sequence worked, what was actually happening in the pan, what the food was telling you when it changed color or texture or smell. Ellis asked why constantly, in that eager, slightly self-conscious way of the very young who are not sure yet whether their questions are annoying or valuable. She told him every time. She had been the beneficiary, at his age, of a father who answered questions rather than dismissing them, and she understood what it meant to have someone take your curiosity seriously. The menu she had designed for the first Friday dinner was ambitious without being reckless. Ambitious enough to justify traveling for, not so ambitious that execution at volume would break down. A slow-roasted beef, the kind that she had perfected over years of high-quantity cooking, the kind that filled a room with the smell that did more advertising work than any posted notice. Cornbread made with real butter, baked in cast iron, a bean and vegetable stew built from the ranch's own stores, thick and dark and deeply flavored from the long cooking. Dried apple pie using the preserves she had been putting up weekly since her arrival. Coffee, as much as they wanted, because people who feel welcome drink more coffee, and people who drink more coffee stay longer, and people who stay longer tell more people. Rhett had the notice posted at the Sheridan Trading Post, at the way station 6 miles east, and at 2 neighboring ranch gates. Plain language. Friday community dinner, Callahan Ranch. Sundown. Bring your appetite. Fair price. She had written the notice herself. On the Friday morning before the first dinner, she woke at 4 and lay still in the dark for exactly the amount of time it took her to run through the entire day's sequence from start to finish. Every element, every timing dependency, every contingency. It was something she had done before every major cooking endeavor since her first day running the mining camp kitchen, and it served the same purpose a carpenter's measurement serves. Not because she was uncertain, but because certainty required the work. Then she got up and began. The kitchen became, over the course of that day, a kind of sustained controlled emergency. Not chaotic, not frantic, but operating at a level of intensity that required everything she had. Ellis was there at 5 without being summoned, which she noted and was grateful for. He moved efficiently through the prep work, asking questions only when he needed answers and working in silence the rest of the time with a focus that seemed to surprise even him. 2 of the other hands, she had chosen Patterson and a quiet older man named Greaves, arrived at noon to help set up the long tables outside, which they had borrowed 3 additional planks of lumber to extend, and to understand their evening responsibilities. Dolan had appeared that morning near the woodpile, splitting extra fuel with a wordless, industrious energy that she chose not to comment on. By late afternoon, the smell had already reached the road. She knew it had because she could see it, in the way 2 men on horseback slowed as they passed the entrance, in the way one of them stood up briefly in his stirrups and looked toward the main buildings, in the way they exchanged a word, and then, without appearing to make a particular decision, turned their horses up the drive. They were the first of 27 people who came to the Callahan Ranch that first Friday evening. 27 people from 6 different properties within a half-day's ride, plus 4 travelers who had been on the road and whose horses had apparently made the same decision as that first pair. They came in 1s and 2s and family groups, settling at the long tables with the slightly self-conscious sociability of people who do not know each other well but are united by a common purpose. They were quiet at first, the way strangers are quiet, making the careful conversation of people who are not yet sure of the rules of the place. Then the food arrived, and the thing happened that Mabel had been counting on, that she had understood from her first day at the ranch, that she had been building toward through every efficient adjustment and every carefully maintained ledger and every 5 o'clock morning. Food, real food, made with attention and care, and the deep understanding of what a body and a spirit actually need. Food like that does something that no other single human act quite replicates. It opens people. It reminds them, in some register below conscious thought, that there are people in the world who consider their comfort worth effort. It produces the particular relaxation of being, for a moment, genuinely cared for. The conversation at those long tables began slowly, warmed steadily, and by the time the pie came out had become something that could fairly be described as joyful. Mabel moved between the kitchen and the tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who has always known how to be present without being obtrusive. So, refilling, checking, making sure the coffee was hot, and the bread basket never went empty. She did not seek attention. She did not introduce herself or explain her philosophy or invite compliments. She simply ensured that every person at those tables had what they needed and that what they needed was there before they knew to ask for it. A woman named Clara Adler from a farm property 5 miles north found her near the kitchen door near the end of the evening. Clara was perhaps 50, with the sturdy, no-nonsense presence of someone who had built a useful life in difficult country and had a clear-eyed understanding of the difference between performance and substance. "I want to know," Clara said, without leading up to it, "who made this food?" "I did," Mabel said. Clara looked at her for a moment with an appraisal that was different in kind from the appraisals Mabel usually received, directed at something other than the obvious. "The beef," Clara said. "The spice in the rub. That's not a common combination." "My father's method," Mabel said. "He experimented with it for years. I've adjusted it slightly." "You've improved it," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has been eating seriously for 50 years. "Tell Callahan this is worth doing every week. I'll bring my sister's family from the valley." She walked back to her table. Mabel stood at the kitchen door for a moment, watching Clara settle back into conversation with the people around her, and let herself feel quietly and briefly the clean satisfaction of a thing gone right. The 27 people who came to the first dinner left behind $14.30, which was $4 more than Mabel's most conservative projection. Several of them, in the easy way of people departing a good evening, mentioned to Rhett on their way out that they'd be back next week, some of them adding unprompted that they'd be telling people. One of the traveling men shook Rhett's hand and said it was the best meal he'd had in 3 years of road travel, which was true enough in its way, and would travel with him to wherever he was going next. Rhett stood at the edge of the porch in the cold night air after the last wagon had gone, looking at the empty road in the particular way of a man trying to reconcile what he expected with what happened. Mabel was carrying dishes back inside, passing near enough that he spoke without looking directly at her. $14, he said. $14.30, she said. He was quiet for a moment. What's the projection for week 4 if the numbers continue on this curve? 30, conservatively. 42 if the word travels the way I expect it to. He didn't say anything else. She went back inside. But she had heard, in the brief silence before she was out of range, the particular quality of his exhale. Not quite relief, because relief implied the emergency had passed, and it hadn't, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man who has been holding a problem alone for a very long time, and has just discovered that he is not, after all, entirely alone with it. She washed the dishes. She was not a person who let herself feel too much about things too quickly. She had been burned by that before, by allowing herself to believe that a turning point was a turning point before it had fully turned. She had learned to keep her own counsel, to let circumstances develop before she decided what they meant, to live, as much as possible, in the facts as they were rather than the facts as she hoped they might become. But she was honest enough in the quiet of the kitchen to acknowledge that something had shifted tonight. Not just in the ranch's finances, in something harder to name and more important, the texture of the place itself, the way it felt to be inside it, the subtle but undeniable change in the quality of the air when people know that something good has happened in a place that needed something good. She finished the dishes, dried her hands, and went to bed. The following 3 weeks held all the compressed intensity of a thing gaining momentum. The kind of momentum that, once you've seen it start, requires very little from you beyond the discipline not to interfere with it. The second Friday dinner drew 31 people. The third drew 44, including Clara Adler's sister's family and a party of 7 from a property Mabel had not known existed, 2 valleys over, who had heard about the food from a man at a trading post in Sheridan and ridden the better part of a day to verify the report. The same people who had mocked her at the fence were now, quietly and without ceremony, adjusting their behavior in ways that ranged from Dolan's wordless firewood contributions to Patterson telling the travelers at the second dinner, unprompted and with a straight face, that the cook at the Callahan Ranch was the best in 3 counties, which was a statement he would have laughed at 6 weeks earlier and now appeared to mean with complete sincerity. She noticed all of it. She said nothing about any of it. She cooked. It was on the fourth Friday, 2 days before the dinner, that the storm came down. It arrived on a Wednesday evening, fast and severe, the kind of early November storm that the mountains produce when they have decided to remind the plains of their authority. Not a slow-building weather event, but a sudden, total assault of wind and snow that closed visibility to almost nothing within the first hour and drove the temperature down so fast that the water in the pump froze before midnight. Mabel had banked the range as high as she safely could and spent the night monitoring the cookhouse temperature because she had put up preserves that week that could not be allowed to freeze. By Thursday morning, 3 of the hands were out in the whiteout conditions looking for cattle that had not come in before the storm hit. By Thursday afternoon, there were 2. By Thursday evening, there was 1, which was Rhett. He had been gone for 3 days. The ranch ran on in his absence with the automatic momentum of a working property whose systems were functioning. The hands knew their jobs. The daily work continued, and Mabel held the cookhouse to its routine with the consistency she always held to, because routine in difficult conditions is its own form of holding things together. She fed the men who came in from the cold with extra portions and hot coffee and did not talk about what was not yet certain. But she knew from the way the other hands talked around the subject in the careful, oblique way of men who are worried but unwilling to name it directly, that 3 days in a storm of this severity was a long time, and that the north pasture where the missing cattle had last been seen was 5 miles from the nearest shelter. He came back on the morning of the 4th day. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of a horse moving very slowly up the frozen road, with the labored rhythm of an animal that has covered difficult terrain in poor conditions and has very little left. She was at the cookhouse door before she had consciously decided to move, and she stood in the cold morning air and watched Rhett Callahan ride into the yard on a horse that was moving on stubbornness rather than strength, with his coat crusted with ice at the collar and his face gray-white from cold and 3 days of sustained exhaustion. He got down from the horse without falling, which appeared to require more effort than it should have. 2 of the hands came immediately, taking the horse, asking questions, moving with the urgent efficiency of people responding to something that has been quietly dreaded. Rhett answered them briefly, his voice flat and rough in the way voices go when the body has been pushed hard for too long. He had found the cattle, most of them, in a draw 4 miles north. He had spent 2 nights in a line cabin, 1 night in the open. He had a cut on his left forearm from a fall on ice that needed attention and had not, evidently, received it, which she could tell from the way he held the arm slightly away from his body. She did not crowd in with the others. She went back into the kitchen and she began. She knew what she was making before she fully thought it, the same way she knew what a body needed in cold conditions before the body itself had spoken. It was the recipe that lived deepest in her, the one she did not need to think about because it had been thought about so many times, and by someone she had loved, that it had become something like instinct. Her father's beef stew. Not a complex dish by the technical standards she had developed over years of serious cooking. Not clever, not sophisticated in its construction, not designed to impress, designed to restore. Built around the understanding that when a person has been depleted, the first thing the body needs is not stimulation, but recognition. The taste of something that knows what you need and gives it to you without requiring you to ask. She had made this stew in moments of her own depletion, on the nights after her father died, when the farm had to be sold and she had stood in the empty kitchen and made this recipe with the last of what was in the pantry, not because she was hungry, but because making it was the only form of presence with her father that was still available to her. She had made it in the mining camp when a man had been brought in from an accident and there was nothing useful left to do but feed him well. She had made it in the boarding house when winter was bad, and the women who worked there were tired in that particular way that goes past physical. She knew what this recipe was for. She built the base slowly. The beef rendered down. The vegetables softened until they gave up their structure. The broth built from the bones she had been saving for a week without knowing exactly why, as if some part of her had already understood they would be needed for something that mattered. She seasoned it with the judgment of someone who has made this dish hundreds of times, not measuring, not thinking, adjusting by smell and taste and the color of the broth, which should be deep and dark and should smell like warmth made physical. She let it cook for 2 hours. Then she put it in a bowl, a wide, plain bowl, full enough to be generous, and she carried it to the main house. He was at the table. Someone had cleaned and wrapped the arm, done a reasonable job of it. He had changed clothes. He had not eaten. She knew this somehow before she saw the empty table, the same way she always knew the things she needed to know about the rooms she was cooking for. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and the blankness in his face that she had come to understand as his version of being at the end of something. Not defeat, not quite. Rhett Callahan was not a man who arrived easily at defeat, but the expression of a man who has fought very hard for a very long time and is sitting in a rare, honest moment of not knowing whether it has been enough. She set the bowl in front of him without speaking. He looked at it. She turned to go because that was the right thing. To give him the meal and the privacy together, to not require anything from him in return. Thornton, she stopped. Stay, he said. It was not quite a request and not quite an order. It was the word of a man who is more tired than his pride usually allows him to admit, and has decided, for this one moment, not to manage that. She pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. He picked up the spoon. She watched him take the first mouthful. Not intrusively, not with the expectant look of someone awaiting a reaction, just watching the way you watch someone you are quietly concerned about, with the attention that says, I'm here rather than perform for me. He stopped. It was not the stop of someone who has found something wrong. It was the stop of someone who has been struck by something unexpected. A full-body pause, the spoon still in his hand and something moving in his face that was not like anything she had seen there before. Not the controlled flatness, not the near amusement, not even the focused directness of their working conversations. Something older and more private than any of those things. Something that had come from somewhere below the part of himself that he managed carefully and had arrived without permission. He sat with the spoon in his hand for a long moment. When he set it down and looked up, his eyes were not wet. He was not a man who cried, she suspected, or not easily, but they had a quality she had not seen in them, a kind of openness, a temporary absence of the careful distance he normally kept between himself and everything around him. My mother, he said. It came out low, almost involuntary. She made... It's the same... He stopped. Mabel said nothing. She understood that this was not a moment for words. She died when I was 9, he said, after a moment, in the flat tone of an old fact that has been stated so many times it has worn itself smooth. I don't remember the taste of things. Not usually. He looked down at the bowl. How did you... My father's recipe, she said quietly. Some things are older than the person making them. He was quiet for a long time. She sat across from him and let the silence be what it was. Not uncomfortable, not requiring resolution, just the honest quiet of two people sitting in a kitchen after something real has happened. Outside, the Wyoming morning was cold and bright with the particular hard clarity that follows a severe storm, the sky scraped clean, the light sharp on the snow. The cookhouse would need starting, the hands would need breakfast. The world would resume, as it always did, with its requirements. But for this moment, in the plain kitchen of a struggling ranch in the mountains, something was different. She could not have said precisely what it was. She was not a person who rushed to name things, especially not things that were still forming, but she knew, with the same deep, unhurried certainty she brought to the dough and the broth and the fire temperature and the careful projections in her ledger, that something had shifted in the distance between herself and this man. Not enough to speak of. Not yet. But enough to know it had happened. Rhett looked at the bowl again, then at her, and then he picked up the spoon and finished his stew in a steady, quiet way, as if something had been settled. Not announced, not declared, simply settled, in the space between one bite and the next. She waited until he was done. Then she picked up the empty bowl and walked back to the cookhouse, and she started the fire for breakfast, and she began again. The way she always began again, with her hands in the work and her mind already in the next moment and the one after that, building forward, building steady, building toward the things she could not yet entirely see but had long since learned to trust were there. The storm had taken something out of the ranch and left something else behind in its place, a subtler tension, the kind that settles into a place when people have been frightened without quite admitting it and are now in the careful business of returning to normal without acknowledging how far from normal they had come. The hands worked with the particular focused energy of men who have been reminded that the country they live in is not, ultimately, on their side, and who have responded to that reminder by recommitting to their tasks with an almost aggressive competence. Fences were repaired with extra care. Animals were checked twice. The feed rotation that Mabel had suggested 2 months ago was now executed with a precision that required no oversight. Rhett moved through the days following his return with the same controlled efficiency he always projected, but Mabel noticed the differences that the other men probably didn't. He was sleeping less. She knew this because the lamp in the main house was still lit on 2 of the 3 mornings that week when she rose at 4:30, throwing its thin rectangle of yellow light across the dark yard. He was eating more deliberately, in the way people eat when they are using food as fuel rather than pleasure, cleaning his plate with methodical thoroughness and returning to work before the other men had finished their coffee. And he was making decisions faster than before, the kind of accelerated decision-making that comes not from confidence, but from the pressure of a timeline that has quietly become urgent. She understood all of this. She said nothing about it. What she did was make sure the coffee was always hot, and the meals were always ready, and the ledger was always current, because those were the things within her power, and she had long ago learned the discipline of concentrating her energy on what she could actually affect. The 5th Friday dinner drew 61 people, and Mabel had not projected 61. Her optimistic projection had been 52, and she had prepared for 55 as a practical buffer. When the wagons kept coming up the drive as the sun went down, families she recognized from previous weeks, new faces she had never seen, 2 entire parties from over the Eastern Ridge who had apparently organized their trip together. She did a rapid, calm recalculation of what she had in the kitchen and what could be extended without compromising the meal, and she sent Ellis back to the pantry 3 times for materials she had been holding in reserve and had not planned to use until the following week. The dinner was slightly leaner than previous ones. Not noticeably, she did not believe in letting a constraint become visible to the people on the other side of it. But she knew in the specific and technical way she knew all things about her kitchen that she had been within 15 portions of a serious problem. After the guests had gone and the cleanup was nearly finished, she sat down with the ledger and spent an hour revising the supply plan for the following month. She also spent 20 minutes writing down, in the clearest language she could manage, a request that needed to go to Rhett the next morning. She needed more resources, not extravagantly more. She had run the numbers carefully enough to be specific about exactly how much more, down to the dollar. But the dinners had grown faster than the most optimistic projection, and the supply infrastructure that had been adequate for 50 people was no longer adequate for 60, and would not be adequate for the 70 or 80 she expected in December if the growth curve continued on its current trajectory. This was a good problem. She understood it as a good problem. But a good problem handled poorly becomes a bad problem, and she had no intention of letting that happen. She brought the request to Rhett after breakfast the next morning and laid it on the table beside his coffee. He read it without speaking, which was his habit, then turned back to the first page and read it again. "You're expecting 80 people in December," he said. "Conservatively. I want to be equipped for 100. He looked up. "That's a significant supply investment, against which the revenue projection at that volume is—" She turned to the second page and pointed to the column. He looked at the number. The silence that followed was the kind she had come to associate with him working through something. Not hesitation, but the particular quiet of a methodical mind moving through a calculation with the same care she applied to dough. He trusted her numbers by now. She knew this not because he had said so, but because he had stopped asking her to walk him through the assumptions and had begun simply using the projections as operational facts. "Do it," he said. "There's one more thing." She had debated how to raise this, and had decided, as she almost always decided in the end, that the direct approach was the only one that didn't waste both their time. The Friday dinners are working, the financial picture is improving, but the underlying debt situation hasn't changed enough yet. The bank's timeline, I know the bank's timeline. I know you know it. I'm raising it because I have a thought about how to address it more directly. She paused. The dinners are producing revenue, but they're producing it slowly, one Friday at a time. What if there were a larger event, something that pulled in the kind of money that moves the debt timeline in a single motion instead of incrementally? He set down his coffee. What kind of event? A harvest dinner, not just the Road families, the whole county. Advertised widely, priced accordingly. A one-time event, positioned as a genuine occasion rather than a weekly routine. People pay more for something they're told is special, especially if the reputation preceding it is good enough. She met his eyes. A reputation is good enough. Rhett leaned back in his chair. It was a gesture she had come to recognize as him creating physical space to think more freely, as if good ideas needed room to arrive. You'd need 2 days of preparation minimum. That takes you and Ellis and probably 2 more out of the regular ranch work for those days. I've cross-checked it against the weekly workload. The second week of December is the lightest on the calendar. The cattle are in the winter pasture. The fence season is finished. We can absorb the staffing shift. He looked at her steadily. How much are you projecting? She told him. He was quiet for 5 full seconds, which was, for Rhett Callahan, a long time. That would, he started and stopped. Cover the December installment and make a meaningful reduction in the principal, she said. Yes, if the attendance reaches the midpoint of the range. He looked at the ledger for another moment. Then he looked at her, one of those direct, fully present looks that he gave rarely, and that she had noticed always preceded a decision he had already made but was confirming. Set it up, he said. The December harvest dinner was announced at the end of November, and the response, relayed back to the ranch through Clara Adler and several other reliable sources in the surrounding community, was more enthusiastic than Mabel's midpoint estimate and close to the top of her range. She received, through the post in Sheridan, 4 written confirmations of attendance from families she had never cooked for. People who had heard about the ranch's dinners through the chain of word of mouth that had been running outward from that first Friday evening, like rings on water, spreading beyond her ability to track it into communities and territories she hadn't expected. She was in the cookhouse recalculating the supply order when she heard the sound of a wagon on the road that was moving with the particular purposeful pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has intended to be there for some time. She did not recognize the wagon, but something about it. The quality of the horses, the width of the vehicle, the way the driver held himself in the seat with the ease of a man accustomed to being looked at, put her on alert in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. She learned who it was from Greaves, who had been near the front gate and came to find her before the man had reached the porch. Warren Pierce, Greaves said, in the low, careful tone he reserved for information that required handling. Alone, which is unusual. She had never seen Warren Pierce, but she had built a fairly complete picture of him from the fragments of overheard conversation and the specific kind of silence that fell over the ranch hands whenever his name came up. The silence of men who have decided, without formal discussion, that they dislike a person. Pierce was the neighboring landowner who had been watching the Callahan ranch in the manner of someone patient enough to wait for collapse. He was, by all accounts, wealthy, connected, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having needed to be told that he mattered. She watched from the cookhouse doorway as Rhett came out of the main house to meet him. Pierce was perhaps 50, trim, well-dressed in the frontier sense, with a silver watch chain visible at his vest and the manner of a man who treats every conversation as a negotiation he has already won. He shook Rhett's hand with the excessive warmth of someone performing affability rather than feeling it, and the 2 men stood in the yard with the space between them filled with a particular quality of surface pleasantness that meant neither of them was saying anything close to what they actually meant. She went back to her prep table. She could not hear the conversation and did not try to. She had work to do. She heard about the conversation from Rhett that evening because he came to the cookhouse after supper, not an unprecedented thing by this point in the autumn, but still unusual enough to mean something, and sat at the prep table with his coat still on and the look of a man who has been carrying something all day and has made the decision to set it down. She poured him coffee and sat across from him. Pierce wants to buy the ranch, he said. I assumed as much. Not the whole thing. His voice was controlled in that careful way. He's offering to purchase the eastern parcel. 60 acres. Includes the best water access on the property. Claims he just wants to manage the watershed better. He looked at his coffee cup. If I sell that parcel, I lose the water rights for the north and northwest pastures. The ranch becomes smaller than it needs to be to survive long term. What did you tell him? That I'd consider it. She looked at him. He looked back. Which you won't, she said. Which I won't. He set the cup down. But he knows about the bank situation. He knows the timeline. He came here because he's done the arithmetic, and he thinks that in 6 weeks I won't have better options. In 6 weeks, she said, we'll have the harvest dinner revenue plus 3 more Friday dinners. Have you done the arithmetic on that? A pause. Yes. And? It's close. He said it with the blunt honesty she had come to depend on from him. Never more optimistic than the facts warranted. Never less. If attendance at the harvest dinner meets your midpoint projection, we make the January payment and have a small buffer. If it comes in below the midpoint, it won't. He looked at her. I know it won't, she said, because I know what we're making and I know what it does to people. And I know what people do when something does that to them. They tell others. They come back. They bring people who have never been. She paused. I've been watching this pattern my entire working life. The harvest dinner will meet the midpoint or exceed it. I am not guessing when I say that. The silence between them was different from the silences of earlier in the season. Less formal, warmer at the edges. Two people who have been in a working relationship long enough to have developed their own private language of pauses and glances and the things left unsaid because they don't need saying. Pierce isn't going to stop at one offer, Rhett said. No, she agreed. He isn't. If the harvest dinner works, if the January payment is made, he'll come back in February with another approach. Probably. She wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup, thinking. But the situation in February will be different from the situation now. In February, the Callahan Ranch isn't a struggling property that's behind on its payments. It's a ranch that's recovered from a drought year through innovation, that has an established revenue stream beyond cattle, and that has a community of 60-plus families who have a personal relationship with this place. She looked up at him. That's a different negotiation than the one he thinks he's coming to have. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. You've thought about this more than I have, he said. It was not an accusation. It was a straight, honest observation, and she took it as one. I've thought about it differently, she said. You've been thinking about how to hold the ranch. I've been thinking about how to make the ranch worth holding in ways that Pierce can't simply buy away. He looked at her with the full, steady attention that she had come to understand was his version of something that other men might have expressed more demonstrably. Tell me the difference. She laid it out for him. The distinction between a ranch whose value was entirely in its land and cattle, a value that could be purchased, subdivided, leveraged against, and a ranch whose value included its relationships, its reputation, its position in the community as a place that people chose to be connected to. A place with those qualities was harder to simply acquire. You could buy the land. You couldn't buy the 60 families who came on Friday evenings and had started, in the organic way of communities that form around genuine things, to think of the Callahan Ranch as theirs in some important sense. Clara Adler, she said. She's brought 14 different families to these dinners. 3 of them have told me they've started buying Callahan beef specifically because they ate here. That's not a transaction. That's a relationship. And relationships have mass. They push back. Rhett leaned forward very slightly. You're talking about the community as a buffer. I'm talking about the community as the actual asset, she said. The land is land. The cattle are cattle. But what we've been building on Friday evenings is something that can't be replicated by a man with money who buys a parcel and installs a new fence. He can have the watershed. He cannot have the fact that people in this county feel something about this place. It was the longest speech she had given him in their months of working conversation, and she was aware of it, and she watched his face as she spoke with the careful attention she gave everything, monitoring for the particular blankness that preceded his closing off. She did not see it. She saw instead the closest thing to animated she had ever seen in his expression, a quality of engaged forward attention, the look of a man whose mind has grabbed something new and is turning it over. The harvest dinner, he said slowly. If it's what you're projecting, people will talk about it beyond the immediate county. That's my expectation, yes. And if Pierce comes to the harvest dinner, he'll come, she said. Men like Pierce always come to the thing they've underestimated, because they need to see it up close before they can figure out how to dismiss it. She paused. I'd like him to come. I'd like him to sit at the same table as the 60 families who have chosen to be connected to this ranch, and I'd like him to understand what he's actually dealing with. Rhett looked at her for a long time. Then he said, quietly and without any performance, Thornton, when I hired you, I needed someone to feed 30 men. I know, she said. That's not what you've been doing. She was careful about this. She was always careful when a conversation arrived at a place like this, the place where something real was being acknowledged, where the surface of practical exchange thinned and what was underneath became briefly visible. She had been burned, in her life, by taking those moments at more than their face value, by allowing the acknowledgement of one thing to become the expectation of another. "I've been doing the job that needed doing," she said, which turned out to be larger than the job that was posted. The look on his face then was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. Not the controlled near amusement, not the focused professional attention, but something older and quieter. The look of a man encountering something genuinely rare and knowing it. He did not say anything else. But he did not leave immediately either. He sat for another quarter hour, finishing his coffee, and the conversation that filled that time was easy, in a way their conversations had rarely been easy before. Not the efficient exchange of operational information they had developed, but something more like two people simply being in the same space and finding it, without making a point of it, comfortable. When he finally stood and picked up his coat, he paused at the cookhouse door. "The harvest dinner," he said. "Whatever you need. It gets done right." "It'll get done right," she said. He left. She sat alone in the warm cookhouse for a few minutes after he'd gone, her hands flat on the table, listening to the quiet ranch outside and the Wyoming wind doing its indifferent work across the high plains. The harvest dinner was 3 weeks away. She had already been planning it for 2 weeks. She knew the menu in the same bone-deep way she knew the biscuit dough, not from thinking, but from knowing, the knowledge that lives past the edge of conscious consideration and just is. She knew what she was going to make, and she knew what it was going to do, and she knew, with the steady, unflashy certainty that had been her most reliable companion since the first day she walked into a professional kitchen and understood that this was the thing she was for, that it was going to work. She also knew, and allowed herself to know it, quietly, in the privacy of the kitchen, that something was changing in the architecture of her life at this ranch, in the quality of the days and the texture of the place, and the particular way a certain person looked at her when he thought the information she was delivering was valuable, which was with an attention that had very gradually and unmistakably begun to contain, alongside its professional respect, something else. She was not ready to name that something else. She was, however, ready to stop pretending she hadn't noticed it. The harvest dinner preparations began the following morning, with Ellis at the prep table before she had finished lighting the range, his sleeves already rolled, his eyes already bright with that fierce apprentice focus she had grown genuinely fond of over these months. She set him to breaking down the first of the supply order that had arrived from Sheridan, talking him through the organization as they worked, the same way her father had talked her through it. Not lecturing, not demonstrating for demonstration's sake, but simply working alongside and letting the explanation come from the work itself. Outside, December was arriving. The mountains behind the ranch wore their full winter coats. The road that had brought her here 4 months ago, dusty and unknown and full of the nervous energy of a last attempt, ran cold and quiet in the morning light. She had come here with a recipe box and a last ticket and the stubborn, private conviction that she was worth more than anyone looking at her had yet been willing to see. 4 months later, the same hands that had been laughed at were holding the financial future of a working ranch together, one carefully made meal at a time. She thought, briefly and with something warm behind it, about the woman who had stepped off that wagon and faced the laughter at the fence and kept walking. Then she turned back to the prep table because there was work to do, and she had never in her life needed longer than a moment to remember that the work was the point. That the work, done well and done honestly, was the thing that made the rest of it possible. "The vegetables," she said to Ellis. "Start with the onions, and I'll show you something about how to cut them that keeps the sulfur from getting in your eyes." He picked up the knife with the readiness she had come to expect from him, and they began. The 2 days before the harvest dinner were the most concentrated work of Mabel Thornton's professional life, and she had lived a professional life that had not been short on concentrated work. She and Ellis began before dawn on the Thursday, moving through the cookhouse with the synchronized efficiency of two people who have spent enough hours in the same kitchen to have developed an unspoken fluency. Each knowing where the other was, without looking, each anticipating the next step without being told, the prep table between them flowing with the organized momentum of a serious culinary undertaking rather than the frantic chaos it might have been under lesser preparation. Mabel had written the timeline out the night before on a full page of ledger paper, not the supply ledger, a fresh one, devoted entirely to the sequence of the dinner. Every element plotted against every other element the way a conductor plots a score, understanding that the dish you start on Thursday afternoon is the one that will be ready Saturday evening, and that the timing of everything else radiates outward from that anchor. Patterson and Greaves had been assigned to the dinner for both days, and they came to it with the willing seriousness of men who had been at enough Friday dinners to understand that something real was being built here, and that their part in it mattered. Dolan, without being asked and without announcing it, had taken on the task of managing the firewood situation for both the cookhouse and the outdoor fire pits Mabel had asked to have constructed for the event. 4 of them, positioned at the corners of the long table arrangement in the yard, which would serve both to provide warmth for outdoor seating and to give the arriving guests the sensory welcome of open fire and winter air, which she had calculated, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, would produce the specific combination of warmth and occasion that she needed people to feel the moment they came up the drive. She had thought about the harvest dinner the way she thought about all serious cooking, not as a collection of recipes, but as an experience with a designed arc. What people felt when they arrived, what they saw first, what smell reached them before any other, the sequence of the meal itself, how each element set up the next, how the textures and temperatures and flavors moved through the evening in a progression that built rather than merely accumulated. The moment, she always designed toward a moment, when the meal delivered something that exceeded what the eater had been expecting, not through surprise for its own sake, but through depth, through the honest delivery of more than the minimum, which was the thing she had always understood to be the actual definition of generosity. She wanted Warren Pierce at that moment. She wanted him there when it happened, in the middle of 60 families who had already decided what this place meant to them, so that he would understand clearly and without ambiguity what he was actually proposing to take apart. She had not said this to Rhett in exactly those terms, but she thought, from the quality of his attention during their recent conversations, that he understood it without being told. The Friday dinners continued during the preparation week. She was not willing to break the established rhythm, which had become its own form of community contract. A promise made weekly and kept weekly that she was not going to interrupt for any reason short of catastrophe. The Friday dinner the week before the harvest was smaller than the previous weeks, partly because some of the regular families were holding their attendance in anticipation of the larger event, and partly because the Wyoming December had arrived in earnest, and the roads were genuinely difficult on cold evenings. 38 people came. Every plate came back empty, as they always did. 3 families who had not been before came for the first time, which meant they had heard about it from someone else, which meant the radius of the ranch's reputation had expanded again. She documented all of it in the ledger. By the Saturday of the harvest dinner, the cookhouse had been running at full intensity for 48 hours, and Mabel had slept 4 hours total across those 2 days, which was not ideal and was also exactly what was required. She had learned, a long time ago, that there were times when the work demanded everything, and the appropriate response was to give it. This was one of those times, and she gave it without complaint and without drama, moving through the morning preparations with the steady, unhurried competence of someone who is tired in the body but nowhere near tired in the will. Ellis was flagging slightly by mid-morning. He was 19 and had been working nearly as long as she had, and the youth that gave him his energy also gave him a more honest relationship with exhaustion than she had developed over years of practice. She sent him for a 2-hour rest after the noon preparations were complete, which he took without protest, and he came back sharper, which was the point. At 3 in the afternoon, she stood in the middle of the cookhouse and ran through the complete menu in her mind one final time. The roasted beef. 2 full animals slow-rendered over the outdoor pit since yesterday morning, at the point now where they needed only maintenance and patience. The bread, 12 dozen rolls baked in rotating batches, filling the ranch with a smell that she could track. From the cookhouse, spreading outward across the yard and toward the road. The 3 large pots of her father's bean stew, modified to harvest scale, running on the back of the range at the precise simmer she had been monitoring all day. The corn pudding, a recipe she had developed herself over years, rich and substantial, and unlike what most people expected when they heard the name, the kind of dish that produced the particular expression of pleasurable confusion she aimed for. And the pies, 16 of them, apple and dried berry, cooling on the long shelf she had constructed specifically for this evening from 2 boards borrowed from the carpentry shed. Everything was ready. She washed her face, changed into the clean dress she had pressed that morning, pinned her hair with more attention than she usually gave it, and went to stand at the cookhouse door to watch the first wagons come up the drive. They came steadily from 4 o'clock onward, emerging from the early winter dark in pairs and families and small processions, the wagon lanterns moving up the road like a slow procession of fireflies in the cold. Mabel had asked Ellis to count, quietly, so she would know when they were approaching the outer limit of her preparation. He came to her at 4:30 with his eyes slightly wide. 73, he said, and there are still wagons on the road. How many? I can see 3 more sets of lights from the gate. She did the arithmetic instantly, the way she always did. We're fine, she said. Tell Patterson to open the second table extension and get the 3rd bread batch in the oven now, not in 20 minutes. He moved. She turned back to the cookhouse, and the controlled emergency quality of the day deepened into its final intensity, the place where she had always felt most precisely herself, in the exact center of a large, complex, fully committed undertaking, everything depending on the accumulated quality of all the preparation that had come before. No room left for error and no need for it because the preparation had been sound. 81 people came to the harvest dinner at the Callahan Ranch on the 2nd Saturday of December, 1887. Warren Pierce was among them. She saw him arrive from the cookhouse window. The same good horses, the same silver watch chain catching the firelight as he stepped down from the wagon, and beside him a woman who had to be his wife, well-dressed and faintly surprised by the scale of what she was arriving at, turning to look at the full tables and the firelit yard with an expression that was trying to be composed and was not quite managing it. Pierce himself scanned the crowd with the practiced eye of a man calculating social geometry, and she could see the moment when the calculation produced a result that did not match his expectation. When he understood, taking in the 81 people filling the yard and the tables and the spaces between, that this was not a struggling ranch's desperate bid for revenue. This was a community event. This was a place that people had chosen, in numbers and with conviction, to be connected to. She watched his face make that adjustment. Then she went back to the stove, because the beef needed attention and she had an evening to execute. The dinner unfolded the way she had designed it, with the patient, building quality of a well-composed thing, each element arriving at the right moment. The crowd moving through the progression of the meal with the loosening, warming quality that serious food reliably produces in serious quantities with the right company around it. She heard the sound of it from the cookhouse, the conversation rising through the first course as people settled in, deepening and broadening through the main meal as comfort established itself, taking on the particular resonant, overlapping quality of 81 people who have been well-fed and are genuinely glad to be where they are. Clara Adler came to the cookhouse door twice during the evening. The first time she simply stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at Mabel at the center of the organized motion of her kitchen, and nodded once with the authority she brought to everything. The second time she came inside and said, in the no-frills way she had, "There's a man out there, gray vest, silver watch, who has tried to start a conversation about property values 3 separate times this evening and has been politely ignored all 3 times by people who are more interested in talking about your pie." Mabel looked at her. Clara's expression was the composed frontier version of deeply satisfied. "Thought you'd want to know," she said, and went back outside. Mabel turned back to the stove. The pies went out at 8 o'clock, and the moment she had designed the evening toward arrived with them. Not with any fanfare, not with any announcement, just with the honest delivery of a thing made carefully to the people it had been made for. She heard it in the particular quality of the silence that followed the first taste, that brief, involuntary pause before language catches up to experience. She heard it ripple through the crowd. She heard the sound that followed it, which was the sound of 81 people deciding, simultaneously and without coordination, that they were somewhere worth being. Rhett found her at the edge of the cookhouse door sometime after 9, when the evening was winding toward its close and the wagons were beginning to assemble for the cold drive home. He came around the side of the main building with the long, quiet stride she had learned to recognize at a distance, and he stood beside her in the cold December air, and they looked together at the yard full of lantern light and conversation and the last of the evening's warmth. He didn't speak immediately, neither did she. They stood in a silence that was not empty, but full. The comfortable, specific fullness of two people who have been through something together and are standing at the far edge of it, looking back. 81 people, he said finally. 81, she agreed. The revenue? I'll have the full count tomorrow morning, but we're above the high projection. He was quiet for a moment. In the yard, she could see Patterson helping an older couple with their wagon, and Ellis talking animatedly to a young woman about his age who appeared to be listening with more attention than the subject, which Mabel strongly suspected was cooking, strictly required. And Dolan, at the far fire pit, tending the coals with the patient, private care of a man who has found a use for himself that he didn't expect to find. Pierce spoke to me before he left, Rhett said. She waited. He made a revised offer, higher than the first, same parcel, more money. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the yard, his profile clear and angular in the cold firelight, the scar along his jaw faint and familiar by now. And, she said, I told him the eastern parcel isn't for sale. He paused. I told him the ranch isn't in the kind of difficulty that requires selling anything. Is that true? He turned and looked at her then, directly, with the full, unguarded attention that had been becoming more frequent over these months, and that she had stopped pretending not to notice. Based on tonight's numbers, yes. We make January's payment, we make February's. By spring, if the Friday dinners continue at their current level, we have the kind of buffer that changes the conversation with the bank entirely. And if Pierce comes back in the spring with another offer, let him come. There was something in his voice, not anger, not bravado, but the quiet, grounded certainty of a man who has moved from defending to knowing. By spring, this ranch is not the same ranch he's been calculating against. He can recalculate. They stood in the quiet for a moment. Then Rhett said, without looking away from her, I want to ask you something. The quality of the air changed, barely perceptibly, the way air changes when the thing that has been building for a long time finally arrives at the surface. Go ahead, she said. When your contract ends in March, he stopped. Started again, with the careful honesty of a man who has decided that the frontier approach, direct, no preamble, accept the result, is the only one that suits him. I'd like you to stay, not as a contract cook, as a permanent part of this ranch. Another pause, shorter. As a permanent part of my life, if you're willing. Mabel looked at the yard. She looked at the 81 people. Well, fewer now, the wagons departing in ones and twos, but the warmth of the evening still present in the way people moved and spoke. She looked at the cookhouse she had transformed from a forgotten outbuilding into the heart of a community. She looked at the ledgers she had maintained and the waste she had eliminated and the recipe she had made for a man who had come home 3 days cold and injured and ready to surrender, and the thing that recipe had opened in him, and everything that had grown from that opening. She had come here with nothing but calloused hands and a recipe box, and the stubborn conviction that she was worth more than anyone looking at her had yet been willing to see. She thought about the woman who had stood at that fence and listened to the laughter, and kept walking. The room at the back of the cookhouse still has a draft, she said. Rhett looked at her steadily. I know. I've been meaning to fix it since October. I know that too. If I stay, she said, I'm going to need a proper kitchen. The range is old and the pantry is too small for the volume we're doing, and I'll need Ellis to stay through winter. He's past the point where losing him makes any sense. He was watching her face with the expression she had finally, after months of careful observation, fully translated. The expression that was not the near amusement, not the professional attention, not the focused gray-eyed assessment, but the one underneath all of those, the one that had been there since the morning of the beef stew and had been growing steadily more present and less hidden with every week that followed. It was the expression of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for and is still slightly amazed that it exists. A new range, he said, expanded pantry, Ellis stays. And the draft. I'll fix the draft myself, he said, this week. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the nearest pit had burned down to its deep, steady coal glow, the kind of heat that is past its visible drama and into its true sustained warmth, the kind that lasts. The last of the wagons were completing their turns in the yard. The stars above the Wyoming mountains were very bright and very cold and very far away and had absolutely nothing to say about what happened between people on the ground. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. Rhett reached out and took her hand. Not with the elaborate gesture of a man who is prepared for the moment. Not with performance or ceremony. Just reached out in the plain and direct way of everything he did, and took her hand in his the way you take hold of something that matters, firmly and without apology, and held it. They stood like that in the cold December air while the last of the wagons disappeared down the road, and the fires settled into their late-night quiet, and the ranch, their ranch, rested around them in the satisfied silence of a place that has earned its rest. Mabel looked out at the empty yard, at the long tables and the remnants of the evening, at the cookhouse window still glowing from the banked range inside. She thought about the road she had come in on, dusty and unknown and full of desperate hope. She thought about the fence and the laughter. She thought about 31 men and a plate of empty biscuit baskets, and the particular silence that follows when something is changed, a room that wasn't expecting to be changed. She thought about all of it from here, from this place, with this hand holding hers, and understood with the clean, quiet certainty that required no argument because it was simply true, that the life you build from the ground up, with your hands and your skill and your stubborn refusal to accept other people's assessment of your worth, is the life that holds. Not the one given to you, not the one assigned, the one you make carefully over time from everything you actually are. The winter settled around the Callahan Ranch. In the months that followed, the things Mabel had set in motion continued to move as she had understood they would, steadily, with the reliable momentum of systems designed by someone who understands how systems actually work. The January payment was made, and the February payment, and by the time the spring thaw opened the mountain roads and the cattle herds were expanding into the new grass. The bank in Sheridan was speaking to Rhett Callahan, not as a debtor whose time was running out, but as a rancher whose account had moved into the category of stable and improving. Warren Pierce sent a formal letter in March. Rhett read it at the breakfast table and handed it to Mabel without comment. It was a final offer on the eastern parcel, higher than the previous two and phrased with the careful language of a man who is making one last attempt and already knows the answer. She put it in the cookhouse stove. The Friday dinners continued through the spring and became a fixture of the county in the way that only things rooted in genuine value become fixtures. Not because they were promoted or positioned, but because people kept choosing them, week after week, the way people keep choosing anything that consistently delivers more than the minimum. By May, Mabel had stopped projecting attendance and started simply preparing for what she knew would come, which was more than the week before and different in its composition, because the word had traveled past the county now, and travelers came from distances that would have seemed implausible in October. Ellis stayed. He had become, over the winter, something that she had not expected when she handed him that first recipe card. Not just an adequate assistant, but a genuinely talented young cook who had found, in the organized demands of serious kitchen work, the structure that his restless Nebraska energy had apparently always needed. She taught him everything she knew in the unsentimental, thorough way her father had taught her, and by spring he was executing the Friday dinner prep largely independently, which freed her for the larger planning and the development of new elements in the menu, which she had never stopped working on, because there was always something that could be made better if you were paying attention. Dolan had become, by the quiet and unannounced process by which the frontier changes people who are willing to be changed, something approaching an ally, not effusive, not apologetic for the past, because neither of them were people who trafficked in that kind of currency, but present in the ways that mattered, which were practical and consistent and reliable. He fixed things. He helped without being asked. On the morning after the harvest dinner, he had arrived at the cookhouse door with the explicit and slightly uncomfortable purpose of saying something that he said quickly, in the manner of a man who has rehearsed it but is still not comfortable with the performance. That first day. The fence. I was wrong about you. And then he had walked away before she could respond, which was perhaps the most Dolan thing he could possibly have done, and she had valued it accordingly. The new range arrived in April. Rhett had ordered it from Sheridan in February. The best available, a cast-iron Imperial with a double oven and a warming shelf that she had identified in a supply catalog and circled without comment, leaving the catalog on the prep table, and which he had apparently found and acted on without discussion, which was, she had come to understand precisely how the two of them did things and was precisely right. The expanded pantry was framed by May and finished by June, built to the dimensions she had specified, with the shelving configuration she had drawn out on ledger paper and handed to Greaves, who had turned out to have a carpenter's eye underneath the ranch hand exterior. The draft in the corner of her room was fixed the same week Rhett had promised, with a thoroughness that suggested he had taken the task personally. They were married in the late spring, on an evening when the mountains still held their snow above the tree line, but the valley was full of new grass and the particular clean smell of Wyoming air after a good rain. There was no elaborate ceremony. Neither of them were people for whom elaborate ceremony held much appeal. And the country they lived in had always understood that the substance of a thing mattered more than its performance. Clara Adler was there, and Ellis, and the hands of the ranch, and a considerable number of the Friday dinner families who had arrived without formal invitation because word had traveled, as word always did, and people who feel genuinely connected to a place tend to show up for its significant moments. Mabel wore the good dark wool dress, freshly pressed. Rhett stood beside her in his best shirt, his gray eyes clear and steady, with the look she had first seen in him on the morning of the beef stew. The look of the walls down, the distance gone, a man fully present in his own life for the first time in longer than he could probably account for. She had not spent much of her life imagining moments like this one. She had spent it building things, building toward the next meal, the next problem, the next careful solution, the next demonstration of the value that other people's quick assessments had never managed to see. She had lived, for most of her 26 years, in the forward motion of the work rather than in the possibility of being still. Standing there, in the evening light of the ranch she had helped save, surrounded by the people who had come to know her not through the quick judgment of appearance, but through the slow, honest accumulation of what she was and what she did, she allowed herself for a moment to simply be still. It felt like more than she had known to want. It felt, she thought, exactly right. The Callahan Ranch continued to grow in the years that followed, in ways that Rhett had worked for, and ways that Mabel had engineered, and ways that neither of them had anticipated, which is how real growth usually works. Through the intersection of preparation and time and the particular chemistry of two people who complement each other in the ways that matter and have decided to build something together rather than separately. The debt was gone by the end of the second year. The cattle herds expanded as the drought broke and the land recovered, and the ranch's reputation for quality, in its beef, in its management, in the Friday dinners that had become an institution in 3 counties, made the Callahan name mean something in Sheridan County that it had never meant before. Warren Pierce sent no more letters. The cookhouse was expanded twice before Mabel was done with it, and eventually employed 3 people full-time during the dinner season, with Ellis as the primary cook, having grown, over the years, into exactly the kind of serious professional she had seen in him when he was 19 years old and folding his first recipe card into his breast pocket with the concentrated care of someone holding something fragile and important. She was proud of him in the direct, unsentimental way she was proud of things she had helped build. She told him so once, plainly, and he had looked at the middle distance with the particular expression of a young man receiving something he needed and did not know how to hold, and had said thank you in a voice that meant considerably more than the words. On a morning in late October, a full year after the harvest dinner, Mabel stood at the cookhouse door in the early light and looked out at the ranch. The mountains behind it wore their new snow. The yard was quiet with the particular quality of early morning, before the day's work had populated it. The long tables were folded and stored for the week, waiting for Friday. The fire pits were cold, but would be lit again in 2 days. Rhett came out of the main house and crossed the yard toward her, his coffee in his hand, his coat on against the cold, moving with the easy, long-strided purpose he always moved with, but with a quality in it now that had not been there a year ago. A looseness in the shoulders, a slightly slower pace, the quality of a man who has stopped bracing against what's coming and has begun simply living in what is. He came and stood beside her at the cookhouse door the way he had stood beside her the night of the harvest dinner, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the same thing. "Supply order came in from Sheridan," he said. "The full amount." "Good. Ellis says the new recipe is ready for Friday." "I know. I tasted it yesterday. It's ready." He looked at the mountains. She looked at the road. The same road she had come in on, a year and more ago, that dusty, difficult, necessary road that had brought her to this valley and this ranch and this life. which was larger and more solid and more genuinely hers than anything she had traveled toward on any other road in her life. She thought, not for the first time, and in the specific, unhurried way she thought about the things that mattered, about the woman who had stood at that fence. She thought about what it costs a person to keep walking when the laughter follows them, what it requires, the particular kind of strength that isn't loud, that doesn't announce itself, that simply continues, through the dismissal and the mockery and the thousand small moments of being looked at and seen as less than you are, continues and builds and proves, in the only language that ultimately means anything, what it always knew itself to be worth. Rhett reached over and took her hand. She let him hold it, the way she always let him hold it, with the simple, grounded ease of something that has stopped being new and has become, instead, true. The better thing, the lasting kind. The wind came down off the Wyoming mountains, cold and indifferent and vast, the same wind it had always been. She didn't flinch, she never had.